One of the biggest differences between, being a SEAL Team 7, when I was a SEAL Team 7 CO, I may not, give orders to run the team on a day-to-day basis. That's the number 2 guy, the executive officer's job and the operations officer. But I had my hands, on the controls. And, but then later when I go to Group 1 and it's, teams 1, 3, 5, and 7 are, working for me, each of those commanding officers, that's his team. And I can give a direct order, but he is going to execute it the way he sees fit. And that's a whole different kind of leadership. And understanding those guys and how they functioned and asking myself, what does SEAL Team 3 need? Vice, what does the commanding officer think it needs? That kind of question over and over again.
Hey friends, welcome to this week's episode of the Human Podcast. This is Jeff Wu. The best part about working on the podcast and the human business broadly is meeting and working with incredibly intelligent and inspiring people across the domains of elite sport, scientific research, human performance, and business. One of my favorite people I've gotten to know is Alexander Krongard. He's a retired Navy SEAL Rear Admiral, and this is his podcast debut. We dive into his extensive history in the military, which includes founding SEAL Team 7 and serving in President Barack Obama's National Security Council staff. We discuss senior level experience and leadership, the mindset and mental resiliency of those in service, and the strategy and approaches to tackle the psychological burden of combat and deployment. If you have any questions or thoughts that pop up as you listen, send them our way by emailing podcast@hvmn.com, podcast@human.com. When we have Admiral Krongard back in the future, we'll answer your questions on air. Without further ado, let's get started. Alex, really excited to have you on the program.
I'm excited to be here, Jeff, in your new digs.
Yeah, so we were breaking in the new Human Podcast studio, and you're the first one to break it in. So I couldn't think of a better guest. So I know that we've had so many different conversations touching upon philosophy, business, a life approach, but perhaps to frame up the conversation here, a lot of I think your mindset really comes from your background as a Navy SEAL and a Navy SEAL Admiral. Perhaps we best start from, your background, how you came up, how you grew up, the surrounding there, and how the Navy experience began.
Okay, I won't go all the way back to the beginning, but so I was getting to the end of college and, pretty challenging, shall we say, college experience after 4 years of intense boarding school. And I was looking at going to law school. And the last thing I wanted to do on the planet was, 3 more years of school. And I was looking at options, and one of the options was the military. And I did some stuff with the Marine Corps first, and then I found out about the SEAL teams. And I talked to a bunch of SEALs, and I thought, this sounds good, and I think I can get through training. And I signed up for the SEAL teams. And I think the day I got accepted, which was, say, February of my senior year, I went home, and that night I lay awake thinking, what did I do to myself?
So you got accepted for the SEAL teams before you graduated college.
Back then, you had to get accepted by the SEALs, and then the Navy would accept you. Huh. And they would not, if you did not have a spot in SEAL training, you could not get a commission in the United States Navy. And it was just an odd way they did business back then. And actually, I think they may still do it that way for certain people.
For officer candidates.
And so, and it all comes down to manpower management, really. So I graduated in June. I waited a couple of months, went through Navy Officer Candidate School. And in January of 1986, I started SEAL training. And
this is BUDS, the infamous BUDS.
Yeah, basic underwater demolition SEAL training, BUDS. And it was probably the greatest experience of my life. I say I had a good time. Good time is relative, but it was fun. It was incredibly challenging. But the best part about it was at the end of the day was over. You maybe polished your boots, got your uniform ready for the next day, maybe some other equipment, and then you went to sleep. And you may not get a lot of sleep, but at the end, you woke up in the morning and you faced a new day with new challenges. But every day ended, and And that was something different than college had been, where you could never, I was an English major and I was supposed to read like 3,000 pages a week. And there's no way I was going to do that. And so it was just a better lifestyle. And I expected to stay 3 or 4 years. And, as I tell people, I woke up one day and I'd been in 31 years. And my motivation for staying changed over the years. My first 5 to 10 years, it was just flat out fun. We were jumping out of airplanes, diving, shooting, blowing things up, traveling all over the world. It was really, really interesting. And I liked the people I was with. And like I said, it was fun. And it was also physically and mentally challenging. Yeah. And then over time, you start to, I'll call it professionalize. You become part of the profession of arms. You learn how to do things and you learn what your strengths are within the institution and within whatever organization you're serving. And so by the time I had been in, 15 years, I had worked with not the same group of people that whole time, but with a lot of the same group. And I felt obligations to them and I wanted to do a good job for them. And I think around the 17-year point, I was selected to start a new SEAL Team 7, and went out to Coronado, California right after 9/11. I think I got there the last couple of days of October 2001. And there were 8 of us, and we're supposed to start this SEAL team. And everything was overseas supporting what was going on in Afghanistan. And then later on, by 2003, it was overseas supporting Iraq. And somehow we slowly built the team from the ground up and had a lot of discussions on what we wanted the team to be like and that kind of thing. But while we were having our discussions, the world around us was changing a lot. The Iraq war was kicking off. There was, we were now fighting 2 wars plus there was other stuff going on in the Pacific and down in Africa. And we weren't sure where we were going to end up. I think we went to overseas in September of 2003, and we came back in April of 2004. And in that time period, we consolidated SEAL Team 7 in Iraq for a period of, 4 or 5 months. And it was just fascinating carrying out operations each and every night that we had been training forever to do. And it wasn't quite as exciting for me. I was the guy who, as I put it, their day ended when the sun came up and my day started, taking advantage of whatever they had accomplished the night before and, explaining why it was good or, why it wasn't as bad as it seemed to the people I worked for. And then the sun would go down, the guys would go out again. And sometimes I would go out with them, but at this point in my career, it was pretty obvious that, I had to be there sometimes just to see what was going on and make sure things were going right. But if I was there every night, I'd be in the way and it wasn't my job. And that was a really hard realization to come to that, my job was not what I had trained my whole career to do. It was actually something different. And it was to take care of it was about 280 people, make sure they had what they needed to do their job. And in April of 2004, we all came home, and it was a great feeling to step off the airplane in San Diego and realize what SEAL Team 7 had accomplished in that time period. And since then, what we did in that deployment has been eclipsed multiple times by SEAL Team 7 itself and by every other SEAL team. But back then we were just starting out, and it was a great way to start.
Yeah, that must have been a huge honor to be selected to stand up a new team. I mean, there's 8, 9, 10 different teams, depending on how you count them. So being one of the few founding commanding officers, that's a very selected fraternity, I would imagine.
It's funny. I mean, on the face of it, it seems that way, but I know the guy who started SEAL Team 10 roughly the same time we started SEAL Team 7. And I don't know, we never thought of it that way. It was an honor, but it was, as I put it, I'll go back on my walker to the 25th, anniversary of SEAL Team 7's founding, and I might get recognized that one time, and that's about it.
Right.
I don't know. SEALs have short memories, and I think it's one of our greatest strengths that we don't dwell too much on the past. I think we take lessons from it, but we don't. We don't try to beat whatever it was in the past every day. We look at what the problems are right now and we solve those problems.
Yeah. And that's something I think is important because, I think before getting to know you over the last, year and a half, 2 years, and interacting with folks in the SEAL community and the special ops community, I think in the media, a lot of these commandos or super soldiers are like alpha individuals. And I think the biggest takeaway that I've seen is that, and I think you probably would attest to this, it's not about the individual, it's about the team. And it seems like that's reflecting into not having like a hero worship for any specific SEAL, but just about the whole mission, about the whole team of SEALs.
No, it's all about teams. Yeah. I mean, and from the first day of BUDS, they teach you that. And with the officers, they're really hard on that. Like I can remember at one time in training, I can't remember, something happened, and some guys who were in my boat crew did something. They didn't obey an order quickly enough, or something. I don't remember, whatever it was. And the first time, the punishment was that I was put in a rubber boat, and they lifted me over their heads, and that was to show me that they were literally carrying me, and also figuratively, and that I better make the right decisions, that kind of thing. But the second time something like that happened, the guys got, it was they got their little time in the barrel, so to speak, and their punishment was a little different than getting carried around in a boat. But it's all the instructors going through SEAL training, and back in the teams itself. The last thing you want is an individual. You're looking for a good team player, and as a matter of fact, there are some phenomenal individual athletes, and great. On the outside they do great things that they're not so great in the teams because they're not team players. And a team player is a different sort of person.
Yeah, and I think that's a valuable lesson that crosses into just life in general. I think we're in a society where things and problems are so complex that there's very rarely this case of a lone athlete or a lone genius that solves the world's problems. I mean, the most impactful organizations are tens, hundreds, thousands of people working in the same joint missions. I think that's a kind of a culture that hopefully we inspire and bring to broader society, where we have less people that are selfish and individualistic. One point I wanted to bring up was that you described BUDS as fun. And I think very few humans would describe it as such, right? This is like one of the most hellish, difficult selection programs. What is the pass rate? Like sub 10%, 5%?
30% roughly get through.
Okay.
Historically.
Okay. But even to enter SEAL training, there's a selection. And then once you're even selected for BUDS, there's like a pretty high attrition rate.
Yes, but it's still fun. I mean, I'm not the only person on the planet who thought it was fun.
But I feel like only the SEALs that come out say it's fun. I think everyone else that's a normal person, it's like, God damn, I'm running like miles a day. I'm not sleeping. I'm going through Hell Week, which is 5-6 days of not sleeping and just, doing obstacle courses and boat races and running and having bombs explode around you.
Yeah, I guess one. There are several ways I think it was fun. The first is that you hear all these stories about Hell Week, and like the one I remember is there's.
Can you describe Hell Week in
so Hell Week roughly starts. I don't know what it's like. I'll describe it in 1986 or what I remember, and I don't think it's changed tremendously. You kind of quote unquote go to sleep on Sunday night, and about an hour after you go in your tent or whatever, there are all these explosions and blank machine gun fire and people yelling at you, and you can't see anything. And they do all these drills just to get you disoriented and see how the people who are supposed to be in charge in that situation gain control over the situation. They get you wet, and they have you roll around in the sand and all kinds of other unpleasant things. And then you start a series of events, and the events are like handed down from class to class, the stories of the narrative. And you've heard, you kind of know what's coming, but you don't necessarily know the order. And you're so disoriented that, you can't remember everything anyway. But I like the first or second night. And one other thing, really important thing is if you can make it to so you start Sunday night, if you can make it till Tuesday morning, you're probably going to make the whole thing. I think the majority of the people quit the first night, and then some the second night. Anyway, there was this thing, I don't even know if they do it anymore, called the steel pier, where you took, I can't remember if you took off all your clothes or you had like a pair of triathlon shorts underneath, and you jumped in San Diego Bay. And we did this in February. So, the water's probably in the low 50s, and you did survival floating. And the real reason you're doing survival floating is so that you get your head in the water. And you go survival float, and then they say, oh, we got to get you warm now. So you get up, you lay on the steel pier, which is cold too. And guys come around, and they have blankets wrapped around them, and they rub the blanket. Doesn't this feel nice, sir? And wouldn't you want to be in the ambulance? And, to me, I'd heard the stories about it, and I was cold. I'm not saying I wasn't hurting, but it was also funny from, that, oh yeah, they're trying to get me to, I could understand what was going on. And I was finally living the story instead of just hearing the story. And I was joining, I was one step closer to joining the brotherhood of all the people who had gone through that. And so that, to me, that was fun. And there were tangible rewards, at every step of the way. I made it through another evolution. One of the big tricks to make it through BUD/S is, if you think about it as 6 months or 12 months of training until you get to a SEAL team, you'll never make it. But if you think of it as, 6 minutes or 60 minutes, I got to make it through this, you'll do fine. And it's actually not such a bad way to get through difficult things in life either. If I can just make it through this, I'll be fine.
Yeah, and, just decompartmentalize the problem, right? Just one small portion at a time.
Exactly. And there were other events like that in training, and there's some real famous Hell Week events. Steel Pier is one of them. Taking your boats through the obstacle course is another. They have this long paddle around Coronado Island that is another thing. And as you went through these things and you mentally checked them off, you're like, that's pretty fun. And then and they had, they make fun of people, and you have fights where you throw mud at each other. It's kind of childish at times, but when you haven't any sleep for 5 days, you'll kind of laugh at anything.
Yeah. And I think when we talked about this before, you mentioned that you thought yourself through BUD/S, and it sounds like you very much took that approach where you realized that these were tricks, gimmicks, little stunts that they were playing on you. And it sounded like you were able to rationalize and process that and power through that way. Where I think if you listen to some of the other folks that went through BUD/S, it might have been more of a simplistic, animalistic, just I'm going to power through this. Would you say that there's different approaches to tackling the problem?
Everyone has a different, everyone uses whatever tools they've developed over the course of their life up until BUD/S to get through things. After training, we had a meeting. All the officers met with all the officers who had made it through Hell Week, our class and the classes before us, and we're meeting with the captain in charge of BUD/S. And he had this theory that everyone who made it through Hell Week had gone through some trauma in their life. And they're going around the table, and everyone had some trauma. And they get to me, and I go, sir, I just haven't had that. I had kind of a silver spoon in my mouth my whole life. But what I did have was I had a series of challenging academic situations. I mean, it sounds stupid, but it's true. And then I'd been on, I'd done a lot of outdoor stuff, and I enjoyed it, and I could understand what was going on. And in that understanding, I knew that I could make it through. And the other, they tell you this in training. There are two things they tell you. One is they'll never do anything with you that they don't train you to do first. And the second is they don't do things you're not expected to do things that you're not physically capable of doing. And if you could believe that, which I did, you could make it. And maybe I was too credible with the instructors. I don't know, but when every time we did something, I was like, I can do this, and they wouldn't have us do this if it was going to kill us or whatever. And I think that's how I would describe thinking my way through it. Oh, and then understanding not to, take it as a big chunk, a 6-month chunk, but maybe a 6-minute chunk at times.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I know that just applying that to, even the business world of our startup, right? Like we've been running Human for the last 4+ years. And if you just think about how we've come since it was just like me and Michael, 2 of us together, till now in a new office and a bunch of talented people around us launching, really cool products. That would have been unforeseeable 4 years ago.
People obsess over failure, but they never think about what they're going to do if they're successful. It's funny, like the worst day for a lot of people in the SEAL teams is the day they report to their first SEAL team, because they've been so focused on getting through buds that they don't know what they're going to do after they get to the SEAL team. And I think I got it, in business, people don't think enough about, hey, what am I going to do if I'm really successful in this? And that's why I think you have a lot of these companies that have problems after they hit it big too.
That's sort of the failure of leadership.
I mean, people are hesitant to think about, hey, what am I going to do if I hit it out of the park? But I think you need to think about things just like you need to think about what if I strike out too.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think it's almost like the good problem to have. I think people have enough actual problems to think about where it's like, okay, if I'm actually in a position where we're really successful, I can figure it out. But I think what I hear from you is that don't take that too lightly, because if you're actually doing it right, there's a big chance you can maybe actually hit it out of the park. So you should be thoughtful about that case as well.
And be ready too.
Yeah.
Organizationally, you have to hire the right people to do that. The same guy or the man or woman who got you to the point you're at might not be the next, the person to get you to the next level. And, there's a whole bunch of business literature about this, but, people read it. I don't think they do it.
Did you see that yourself in the SEAL teams? I mean, in some perspective, you hit it out of the park as a naval officer. I mean, you were one of the most senior SEALs, period. You're going from starting SEAL Team 7 to commanding Warfare Group 1, like all the West Coast SEAL teams. Did you have this sort of vision of how you would be a commander and leader of SEALs as you were going through this process? Like, did you plan for your happy case?
No, I lucked out in one sense, or I guess actually in two senses. The first is my father was a CEO of an investment bank, and I grew up listening to him. I mean, I've had like a 50-something year conversation about leadership with him, and that I just gave me a lot to think about and a lot to fall back on. And then the other thing, when I went to war college right after SEAL Team 7, and there was this fascinating course in war college called So You Want to Make a Difference. And what the course was, basically, we were all, let's say, halfway through a potential career of 30 years. We were all at a little over halfway. We were all at 17, 18, 19 years.
Well, these are career officers.
All of us are career officers, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and foreign officers. And this retired Australian 4-star admiral who had been head of their the Australian Armed Forces, the chief of their joint staff, he taught this incredible course that I could best sum up by saying, if I had fallen asleep then, or anyone in the class had fallen asleep and woken up 10 or 15 years later as a 4-star in charge of the U.S. military, how do you approach that? Because it's a different kind of leadership. It has different problems. It has it is not at all like what the officer who steps foot into buds and my case, 1986 faces. And in the process of thinking through that, it's you, as my father, I think, puts it really well. It's not the answers that matter. It's the asking of the questions. And so that Admiral Barry, Chris Barry, he gave us good questions to ask. And so at each stage, I haven't known what to do, but I at least had a good idea of what the questions were.
And what are some of these questions?
What's that?
Can you share some of these good questions?
So one of the questions is, what motivates the people around you? And, why are they there? And that changes. Like, one of the biggest differences between, being a SEAL Team 7, when I was a SEAL Team 7 CO, I may not, give orders to run the team on a day-to-day basis. That's the number 2 guy, the executive officer's job, and the operations officer. But I had my hands, on the controls. And, but then later when I go to Group 1 and it's, teams 1, 3, 5, and 7 are, working for me, each of those commanding officers, that's his team. And I can give a direct order, but he is going to execute it the way he sees fit. And that's a whole different kind of leadership. And understanding those guys and how they functioned and asking myself, what does SEAL Team 3 need? Vice, what does the commanding officer think it needs? That kind of question over and over again. And also just listening more than talking made for, I think hopefully I'm not the best judge of more effective leadership at the group level. And a lot of it was letting people, knowing enough to let people do what they wanted to do and see how it worked out, and only interrupting them, as sporadically as possible, or asking them the right question and getting them to think about it. And they may not do what I wanted, but in answering the question for themselves, they kind of started down that path.
Yeah, that's sort of like the meta leadership. You're not giving the direct orders, but you're helping the functional leaders or the sub leaders make the best possible decision along your strategy.
Exactly. And that's the other thing is your strategy. I used to tell people, if you go to a rifle range, you don't shoot past a certain distance on the left, or a certain angle on the left and a certain angle on the right. And those are called the range limits or something. Anyway, you got to give them the arc that they're going to fire on, and you have to stay inside that, but you let them wander around, inside that arc, and that's a lot of people can't make that transition up, because they want to tell the person what specific place to shoot at. They don't want to let them kind of pick and choose on a generalized, 30-degree arc or something.
Was that the biggest gap from, folks going into the senior ranks like you did versus the people that didn't quite make that, cross that chasm? That,
and accepting, some people don't want, some people frankly and honestly and for great reasons aren't interested in higher leadership, because either they're capable of it, but it just doesn't excite them, or they know they're incapable of it, or, a whole bunch of reasons. But, some people like it. I enjoyed it. And, but I reached my kind of level too. And, you kind of wake up one day and know, hey, I've kind of arrived and it's time to do something else. Yeah. So
what was that realization? I mean, I imagine it wasn't just you rolled over on one side of the bed one morning, you're like, I'm done, or was it? Or is it a combination of factors?
It was kind of like, if you're in any organization long enough, you understand what the organization is seeking in its leaders and who they promote. And while I think I was perfectly capable of going further, there were guys who by experience and talent were better suited than I was. And
in terms of command positions, in terms of deployment experience?
Mostly deployment experience, and also it all depends on what jobs you have. And I had stayed in a couple of jobs. I'd really stayed in one job probably a year longer than I should have. And, I liked it. And I thought I was good at it. And we needed someone to stay in it.
Which job was
that was at the National Security Council staff.
Okay.
But the National Security Council staff makes you great at policy. And frankly, SEAL admirals are not, they're not really paid for policy until a much higher level than I was at. So, there was that dimension of things. And
sounds like politics, basically, like the institutional politics a little bit, where
so there's institutional politics involved, but the guys making the decision, the generals and admirals above me, they had good reasons for picking someone else over me, and sometimes frankly it's just timing. You're at the wrong place at the wrong time, and I certainly had a little bit of that going, but at the end of the day, the best way I can explain it is, I think it was the USS Greenville, it's a submarine, and they had 3 commanding officers in a space of it's like 6 months. And 3 guys had various mishaps. And I think it was the middle guy said he was only there for like a month. And he said he wouldn't trade that month for anything. He was just honored to have had the opportunity. I'm honored to have had the opportunity to, have been an admiral for 3 years and serve as I did. And, I'm not going to cry over what could have been. Do I think about it? Yeah, I think about it. But at the end of the day, things happen for a reason. And perhaps I'm way too big a fatalist, but I'm happy with how things turned out. And, if they had really needed me, I'm sure I would still be there.
Yeah. That just reminds me of a recent conversation I've had around Stoicism, around acceptance of mortality in one sense, but I think what's more applicable is the acceptance of things you just cannot control, right? You just cannot control the timing of when you entered buds or what officer positions, and you have to just play the cards you're dealt, right?
Exactly.
And move forward. You've served alongside some of the most interesting people that are out on the podcast world today. I know that you worked with Jocko Willink, you worked with who has a great podcast. You've worked with David Goggins, who is the ultra marathoner SEAL with a great backstory, and a lot of the SEAL celebrities that you see that have done amazing missions. I'm curious to hear your personal experience with those guys, or any fun stories with some of the the team members that people might have heard about.
I'll start with Jocko as the most colorful. So I've worked with Jocko. I'm almost positive it's 3 times now. And so a couple of things, I've told you some of this stuff about Jocko. So the first is he really is, who you see. That's not an act. He is, he gets up that early, he works out that hard, and he talks that way. But the second thing is, in the 31 years I was in the Navy, I met one SEAL officer, or SEAL period, who could write better than Jocko, who was a better master of the English language than Jocko. I mean, Jocko, phenomenal writer, or at least in my, experience, he was. He is one of the best people I know of training, preparing people for, arduous conditions and challenging situations. He is about as passionate as it's possible for a human to be. And he, he is colorful. And, we have a saying in the teams that, I've heard people say that, if that guy called me at 2 a.m., to rob a bank, I'd go rob the bank with him. I'd probably do that with Jocko. I don't think he would want me on his, bank robbing crew, but, if the opportunity came up, I might take him up on it. Goggins, I just know by reputation. One of the guys who worked for me was very close to him, and like you say, it's an amazing story, and he is a true master of endurance, athletic events. And he was a guy who was able to leverage the experience of being a SEAL and his own personal. We were talking about how you get through butts, his personal motivations to take him even further in the endurance world. And I'm trying to think of some of the other, one of the kind of sad things I found in the SEAL teams, and I may be completely wrong on this, but when I came in the SEAL teams, there were, it was full of characters. I mean, we used to do, in the SEAL teams back in the day, used to do what's called circle PT. We didn't line up in ranks to do PT like the rest of the military. We were in a big circle on the asphalt outside the SEAL team. And, everyone from the lowest ranking guy to the highest ranking guy would be in that circle doing PT. And I'll never forget getting to SEAL Team 1, and there was this guy, a tremendous character, nicknamed Bison Head. And Bison Head he would never PT with everyone else. He would walk around the circle and yell at everyone from the lowest ranking to the highest ranking. I heard him correct the commanding officer of the team, whose nickname was the Hulk, I might add. And he was an AAU powerlifter and wrestler, and, pretty famous SEAL Team 1 guy from Vietnam. And he would correct the Hulk on his push-ups and stuff like that. And
who was Bison Head? Who's a master chief or something? Who was this guy?
He was he was an E6 at the time, so he was well below. He wasn't even a chief at the time.
Jeez.
And he was just his personality, and everyone, he had a role to play in the team, and that was his Bison Head was, that's who he was. And he's great. And I kind of miss all those guys. I'm sure they're still out there, but the world doesn't seem as tolerant of characters anymore in some ways. And anyway, so there were the guys like that. Obviously they're the guys everyone looks up to, the incredible heroes, and but they're all part of the team. And there was the guy who I think is the I don't know what you call him, the most competent operator ever is this guy, Tom Norris, who received the Medal of Honor for, actions in the very late stages of Vietnam. And I'll never forget sitting in the SEAL Team 2 classroom in like 1998 or 99. And he was telling the story of the operations that he received the Medal of Honor for. And he would punctuate his story every so often by saying, but anyone in this room, there are like 200 of us in the room, anyone in this room would do this. And I remember thinking to myself over and over again, anyone in this room would have done what you did because we're all, team guys, but almost none of us would have thought of doing it. I mean, he had a certain, like I'll call it tactical genius. He just knew what to do in a way that, most of us would do had we thought of it. Well, we just never would have thought of it. And, so I of all the guys, he's the guy I think.
It was like a maneuver to rescue other guys, or what was this?
Oh, he was the guy. So I'll get the story wrong, but the gist of the story is like they're at this, the guy Bat 21, this Air Force, I think a lieutenant colonel or colonel with some really valuable information gets shot down over, or bails out, real up close near the border between North and South Vietnam. And they kind of know where he is, but they need someone to go pick him up. And there's like a North Vietnamese invasion coming. And so the first night, these guys leave this embattled fire base, and let's say there are 8 of them. And it's really hairy. They come back, and the next night, only 5 of them go out. And finally, on either the 3rd or 4th night, it's Tom Norris and a Vietnamese SEAL go out, and they paddle upstream in a sampan. They find the guy, they grab him, they hide him in the bottom of the boat, and they paddle back down. And everywhere they look, they're just North of Vietnamese, like tanks and soldiers and everything else. And they just paddle calmly just back through this, and they get the guy out. And I'm sure I've done a complete injustice to the story, but it's just an amazing story. And the thing that I find so incredible is, one, what he didn't do. He didn't call in airstrikes because they would have known that he was there and that kind of thing. He just kind of bluffed his way through. But also that, he knew what the odds were and that the odds were getting worse, and yet he kept going out night after night. And it's amazing.
Yeah, that's. I mean, these are heroes. These are stories that, like, one hopes that they can make some sort of impact at that scale, even on just saving, one particular person's life. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest missions that the SEAL teams do, right? Like hostage rescues or rescue missions. One thing that in a recent conversation that we've had that I thought was interesting was this notion around public service, national service, where you have, it's unlike in a previous generation. I like to think that there's still that patriotism today in our current generation, but do you think that there's a gap between a patriotism or this notion of public service that existed in our culture and American culture 30, 40, 50 years ago versus today?
If you had asked me that question maybe a year ago, I would have said yes. But what I am seeing now, and maybe it's just some weird dynamic in Silicon Valley, is there are a lot of people who want to serve in some way. Now, their notion of how they're going to serve, I think is different. But, I would say that this kind of libertarian bent in Silicon Valley, combined with a real passion about technology and driven by a notion of being of service to others, is having people create, solutions to really hard problems. And they're not, I think people are frustrated by doing it through, certainly not my generation, but the generations before me, they did it through military service or going into government or that kind of thing. And I think people are doing it now by trying to create solutions for government, or maybe serving, episodically in government. And I think, I see more and more that I don't talk to a lot of people my age who are interested in serving the government. I talk to a ton of people from, say, 18 to 32, 33 years old they want to serve some way, shape, or form. And so I think service is coming back, but it's a different kind. It's a different concept of service. So
I think that rings true to me in the sense that even with typical employee-employer relationships, it used to be you serve at a company for 30 years, get the gold watch, and perhaps the new model of like a gig economy where people are, driving for Uber, driving for Lyft, being a contractor. Could you have that similar model in government where there's more of a fresh blood of a full cycle? I mean, I think we can get into a whole can of worms of what we would do to update government and governance. But I think one aspect that I thought was interesting and perhaps is more obfuscated for a lot of our listeners is the National Security Council. I mean, one of the most important national defense bodies, I guess, ostensibly led by the National Security Advisor, who today is John Bolton, advising the president on national security. What was it like being on the council? So you were on the council serving Obama, right? Mm-hmm. What's that experience like? What can you tell about that apparatus?
So I was technically on the staff. The National Security Council, just because I think few people appreciate it, is actually when the president and certain cabinet level officials meet. And the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, as you said, is in the room too. And then they have levels below that where like the cabinet meets, but not with the president.
Like the standing committee or this?
Yeah, they're standing levels.
Yeah.
And then there's a level below that where it's the deputies of the various organizations. And deputy is a kind of a broad notion. It's not necessarily the number 2 guy. It might be the number 3 or number 4 person in a department or agency. And so the first thing I would, and I don't mean this by way of excuse, I mean this, sincerely, is that if a problem gets to the National Security Council level, it by its very nature, it doesn't have an easy solution. You pick the least bad thing. And I was amazed at the number of times. I mostly went to deputies levels meetings. And I was amazed at the number of times I went in the meeting and I thought, there's an easy solution. And then some goofy thing would come up from some agency you never would have thought would have been impacted. But their reason was super sound and you had to take it into account and you ended up with a on the face of it, less optimal solution. But everyone who was in that room knew that was, the best solution you were going to arrive at. And then the problem becomes executing the whatever decision is made. And I think the decisions made were usually pretty sound, but execution, as soon as you make contact with the real world, the best laid plans go awry. As someone whom I greatly respect says, if you go in a football locker room, every play on the whiteboard goes for a touchdown. But in the real world, it's just in a football game, it doesn't happen. Why is it going to happen in the real world? So, the National Security Council, in these meetings, they come up with good plans or good guidance to make the plans is a better way to describe it. But when they execute it, the real world tends to throw wrenches into the things. And it's, the only, politics aside, because obviously politics is going to, color you or it's going to be the basis you make the decision on. But people act like it's so easy to make these decisions. It's hard to make these decisions. And these people spend a lot of time. And I guarantee you the Trump administration is spending as much time trying to figure this stuff out as the, Obama or Bush before them or Clinton before that. And, the model exists for a reason. I think Eisenhower brought it in back in the 50s. So
the apparatus is broad and the talent is broad. It's not just a few people in the room like mastermind the world.
No, they can't. I mean, the cabinet level people tend to be, and the deputies, they are smart and they're great decision makers and they have very competent staffs underneath them, but you're only as good as the information you have. And sometimes you're making decisions based on incomplete information. You can wait to make a better decision, with better information, but the value of the decision decreases or the opportunities lost, may, do bad things to you.
Yeah. I'm just imagining the scale and the layers of decision making to even get to that level. Any tips or lessons learned from that experience where even in our very, very small dealings with the government, there's such a large entity with so many moving parts and structures and organizations. Any tips for or experiences learned from that experience within that apparatus?
Well, I would start with a simplistic version, which is, I'll go back to SEAL Team 7 in Iraq. So I used to say that the intelligence officer, she wanted us to do the mission now because she wanted the intelligence gain from, whatever we brought off target. Yeah. And the operations officer wanted to delay the mission because he wanted to know more so that it was safer for the guys. And so I always used to say, these are like two devils, one sitting on each shoulder. And I would have to split the difference. When did we have enough information to execute the operation at the risk level it was to gain whatever we were going to gain from an intelligence perspective? And sometimes we were just flat out told, shut up and, do it. But most of the time, I could pick the timing. So the first piece of it is it's always there's always at least two conflicting things that you're trying to, there's a word, satisfice. You're trying to satisfice. And then when you ratchet that up multiple levels from, the SEAL team level up to the, presidential level, you get like 10 more of those things. But the things, the stuff I saw, or at least that I appreciated, and I'm not a decision-making expert, but, one, the people in charge who listen to people argue, and then, they make a decision, and then the first thing that should happen is whoever lost the argument should become the biggest supporter of whoever won the argument. And I don't see that happen enough. And that's kind of a follow-up. A lot of it is not the decision made, it's the follow-up. Do you hold the people's feet to the fire to get the decision done? Do you make sure that the person who lost the argument doesn't, submarine the person who won? And, it's a lot of times when a decision's made in a forum like that, people leave the room, and that's the start of the argument, not the end of it. And it should be the end of the argument. And that's where, a good chief of staff comes in, or, just people, like I said, who hold their feet to the fire. And so the ability to listen and the ability to follow through are the keys. I watched General Petraeus in Iraq, and I remember one of the first mornings he came in and was running things. People would brief on something, and General Petraeus would say something like, okay, Bill, I want you to follow up on that, and I want you to go back and tell that reporter that fact was wrong, or I want you to follow up with that commander and tell him I want him doing this, not that. And at the end of the thing, there were like 30 follow-up items, if you will. And I thought it was all just Petraeus saying, hey, do this. And it turned out, I got on the phone back to my 2-star I was working for. I told him the story, and he goes, oh no, Petraeus will follow up on every single one of those things. And Petraeus, one of his many, many abilities was he could just track all that stuff in his head and follow, and he would hold people's feet to the fire. And that's why, in so many instances, he was a very effective commander. And, he had other, not so great things, but that was one thing he was just phenomenal at.
Yeah. I think one of the things that stuck out to me was rally after making the decision. And I think that, and if you have this infighting where people feel like their feelings were hurt, when like, oh, someone else's decision was made, I'm going to torpedo this operation or this decision now. That seems so, that's just destructive to the overall goal. And I think that's something that I think all organizations can really define as part of their culture. Okay, like we're going to have a very argue it out, put it on the ground, be aggressive in the argument, but once a decision is made, rally behind the decisions, execute it.
Yeah. Now, I guess people would accuse me of being manipulative or whatever, but there's just an expression in the SEAL teams, throw the boys a bone. Yeah. And sometimes you have to. Sometimes, if enough decisions have gone the wrong way, it's not necessarily, a lot of times they're not right and wrong decisions. They're just, different decisions. And sometimes you decide in favor of the person who's lost all the decisions to throw them a bone and keep their morale up and show them that sometimes it's going to go their way. And, you don't do that obviously with matters of principle or morality or anything like that. But if it doesn't matter and, you got to keep everyone's morale up. And that's how I've always viewed things. And, I guess it's manipulative, but it keeps the organization together and it keeps the team together.
I don't know if it's manipulative other than just it's intuition. I think it's just this, I think we've talked about this. It's just in any organization dealing with people, and you have to work with a group of people and keeping that group as a whole moving forward. And if it's like showing a bone or manipulating, it's just like, no, it's not good for the whole group to have these decisions in this way. And I think a lot of it's going to come down to intuition. Like, what's the feeling between how this person is operating if they have another decision denied or another decision go against their way?
Yeah.
So perhaps like that's the most important thing. You have a pattern matching database of 31 plus years plus now your business career into how you think about decisions moving forward.
Yeah. And knowing your people is, the other piece. I think, that's part of the intuition factor. And, just being available so people can come in and talk to you. A lot of times, I remember many times solving really hard personnel problems, because those are the worst problems easily. Someone thinks they were, screwed over basically. And excuse me, half the time it was just about listening to their story.
Yeah.
And if they felt they were heard and the decision was the same, they were happy.
Yeah. Obviously, one of the biggest things in our audience here is around human performance. And I have to say that SEALs, obviously everyone looks up to as pinnacles of human specimens. I was recently talking to the current SEAL Team 7 CEO, and he was saying that we're not necessarily like Ferraris. We're like fine-tuned engines. We're like dump trucks that can like handle a ton of load and just like keep plugging away. Curious to hear your thoughts about that, and how human performance and the optimizations of the mission goes into play in naval special warfare.
So one of the things I always used to argue with the guys about was, everyone's always like, SEAL teams need to be more entrepreneurial. And I was like, are you kidding? If we were, if the military were entrepreneurial, we would fail our mission 9 out of 10 times or whatever, the current rate of startup failure is. And so I kind of agree with the SEAL Team 7 guy, the dump truck. I mean, we are just, we are a reliable, we have to be reliable. I might, the example, the metaphor I would use would be different though. I was talking to an Israeli SEAL once, and they were talking. They did not carry at the time the M4, the U.S. weapon rifle. They carried a lot of times for especially swimming through the surf and all the sand and everything. They carried AK-47s. The Russian weapon. And they told a story. He told me 2 interesting things. One, they had dropped an AK-47 off the pier one day by accident, and they found it like 6 months later, and it still worked after being in salt water for 6 months, which I don't know if I believe that, but it's a good story. But
I could believe it. I mean, there's so many AKs in Afghanistan being trucked through desert.
They're overbuilt, certainly.
Yeah.
But the other thing he told me was, I guess his father, they had emigrated from the Soviet Union to Israel, his family, and they said that like a Soviet vacuum cleaner or whatever, when you bought it, it didn't work. But if you could get it to work, it would work forever. It was just so overbuilt and robust. And I think, the stuff, it isn't elegant, but it worked. And that's kind of how I think of the SEAL teams. We're not always, we will do things elegantly, but the what we use to do it elegantly isn't always elegant. And, we tend to, be like dump truckish, I guess. And Buds gets us to work. And once we're working, we work for a long time. And, but we're definitely not a Ferrari. I mean, Ferrari gets, Ferrari's great on a nice flat road. But as soon as you get even remotely bumps or stuff like that, it's so low
maintenance,
maintenance, but it looks wonderful.
Yeah.
And I think you have to be careful and distinguish between effectiveness and looking wonderful. And anyway, that would be my thought on that.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that's a lot of it's like recovery, preservation of the force type notions beyond just, hey, let's make what are already elite athletes even more elite. I mean, I think that's always some part of the discussion, but it seems like the bigger question is, okay, how do we get these guys to last longer? How do we keep them healthy?
Yeah, but when you said elite athletes, what sprung to mind was, I think the only group of people or type of group of people on the planet, like watching them play basketball, that's worse than a group of SEALs is a group of wrestlers. And many of SEALs used to be wrestlers. And so, SEALs are they tend to be good athletes, but not great athletes. And the SEAL, the number one trait is just endurance. I mean, enduring, as opposed, they just make it through stuff. And And, back to the dump truck theory, you have some guys who are elite, truly elite athletes, but generally speaking, the guys are just dump trucks or, just can keep going and going and going and going and going, and they'll get there eventually. So,
that's kind of war, right? It's just like duking it out day in, day out. I'm curious to know the psychological impact. Obviously, I'm sure you could go quite far into that topic, but obviously people come back, sometimes change from combat. What's your experience there? Is there, in addition to physical and resiliency and endurance, can we speak towards like the mental side, the mental endurance and mental resiliency?
And so, first of all, as far as like heavy combat, I'm not the guy to talk to. I was, already, I can't remember, I was in my mid 40s by the time 9/11 hit, and at a rank and job that didn't, exactly lend itself to going out on ops every night. But I think the number one stress inoculation against the stress is the training itself. The fact that you made it through and that you learned to deal with stress in training and in learning how to do your job. The teams have, there's a lot of like mindfulness training out there now, and the teams have, thrown a lot of stuff against the wall to see what works in terms of helping guys with stress. A lot of guys are just predisposed to dealing with stress in a positive way. Instead of post-traumatic stress, they have post-traumatic growth. And I think that template for that is laid down actually in BUDS. And then you keep going through training, and the more training you go through, I think the more ready you are. And then there's the brotherhood, if you'll call it. You can talk to guys, and I think guys, since 9/11, as the war goes on, people are learning about the importance of actually opening up to their comrades and their fellow SEALs, and I think having that group out there to talk to helps. I think talking is a big thing. We have various mechanisms like check up from the neck up and stuff like that, where guys have to talk to the psychologists before they go home, or we have procedures to try to decompress guys from a combat zone back to home. We've done a lot of work, or they, I guess no longer we, on the family side of the equation, because families can be stressors too. Not intentionally, but their expectations a family has, their expectations your teammates have, and trying to make those two meet. It doesn't happen. You can have balance with it sequentially, but not simultaneously. And maybe there's 1% can do that. I don't think very many guys can do that. And so we work with the families about what their expectations can be. Before the guys deploy, they talk to the families. After they come home, they talk to the families, and they brief the families on what to expect when the guys go home. Before they talk about communication strategies, financial, and then there are I don't know how many charitable foundations there are. There are these charities that help the families as well, and the SEALs afterwards. And there is no one answer, and there's a whole bunch of potential solutions. And guys are working with everything from retreats in Montana, it's a great program, to things where they give the wives a break. When the husbands are overseas, they take the wives to a spa kind of thing for a day with childcare. Just things like that to give people, because a lot of times it's just people need a break. Yeah. And that's, the key. But there is no solution. There's only many, many, many solutions.
No, I think that's well said. I think when we, as citizens, see the headlines, you see that like the specific operation, there's such a, the family life. The kids, the wife, the husband. I guess there's no husbands, there's no female SEALs, but
there are women who they're going into combat with SEALs or near combat situations. Okay,
so like that's
there are husbands now in the mix.
Yeah, so it's like the impact and the services is broad. It's like basically the iceberg sort of analogy, right? You don't see like the vast 90% of really what's going on.
No, absolutely true.
Yeah. So what's next for you? So in the business world, I know you got your Series 63. You're officially sanctioned, qualified in the finance world. What are you looking forward to?
I guess I'm learning the number one thing, and I think it's a longer term thing, is when I went to work, in my last few jobs as an admiral, I was ready every day. I kind of had enough experience in the military that I could take whatever problem came my way and, craft a solution. The business world, I still don't have that, those reps. And, I have to learn a lot of new stuff so that I can take the intuition I've built up over years in the military and adapt it to the business world. And some of the stuff is remarkably similar. Some of the stuff is radically different. And a lot of expectations I've had to, basically throw them aside because they weren't correct about the business world. And, but I'm the one, as I go through this, the one thing I'm finding that's really helpful is being here in this area because, there's a certain intensity and obsession. I like the tech. I like the startup world. And so it keeps me intellectually curious and it keeps me learning. Oh, and that's, oddly enough, one of the things the military is really good at is making you a lifelong learner. And, I'm basically in full learning mode now. And I'm trying to figure out, I have best way I can describe it is I have a bunch of puzzle pieces on the table right now. And I think I've got the edges done and I have one or two build-ups in the corner, but I still don't know what's in the center of that business puzzle. And, I'm working towards it. But it's not a picture. And so I don't know what it is yet. I have no idea what I'm going to be looking at.
No, but I think it's super refreshing. I think just, seeing you progress and evolve. I think it's cool. I think very few people can have a storied, illustrious career, 31 plus years, and then basically, start a brand new career. So I think that resiliency just really shows. And I think that curiosity really shows as you're almost attacking this new challenge as probably with a similar fervor as you tackled your initial challenge.
I wish I had that energy.
No, but I think it still carries through. I mean, obviously, there's a little bit more years, a little bit more experience, but hopefully the experience and wisdom accelerates that.
Yeah, no, the whole wisdom, as we've talked about, the whole notion of wisdom I'm fascinated by. And it's really not well defined. And it's some sort of weird combination of emotional control, experience, knowledge, judgment. And, how do I think I had some level of wisdom in the military, and how do I turn that into business wisdom? Can I turn it into business wisdom? And, I hope the answer is yes, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad to introduce you, Alex, to our community here. I mean, I think just knowing you personally for the last couple of years, you've been probably one of the top, 1, 2, 3 people that I've met over the last couple of years. And I know that our audience is probably have a lot of questions for you around your experience, but also your stories and leadership skills. So really happy to introduce Alex to the audience, and I'm sure we'll have you back on the community discussion.
I'll look forward to it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I know a lot of you guys have been writing in at podcast@human.com for different questions or topics or subjects that you'd like myself and our research lead, Dr. Brianna Stubbs, to cover. So let's actually make a Q&A special episode to answer any and all of your questions relating to our own personal performance protocols, our research and backgrounds as biohackers and scientists and business people, to, what's going on at Human, what projects are we working on? What R&D are we working on? What customers? What are the feedback from the Ketone Ester? Happy to address any and all questions. So shoot us an email at podcast@human.com. And once we have a big bank of questions, we'll do a special episode. As always, please subscribe for future episodes of the Human Enhancement Podcast. Give us a 5-star review on iTunes and send a screenshot to podcast@human.com. And we'll send you a free Sprint Mini, our acute focus nootropic. Thanks so much and see you next time.